Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here, and I want to spend a minute just taking in all these amazing faces. So please join me. These are like 2 screens full, people. Well, maybe not quite full, but it's like a lot of people. And it's so wonderful because, of course, this work is all our work. It is not any group's work. It's not any one person's work. It is all our work. So very, very good to see you all here. Thank you for showing up, and thank you for joining in what I hope will be a robust conversation. So let me start by saying thank you to the Mindfulness and Social Change Network for this opportunity to discuss the book, and for your continued work in providing a space for these slightly more edgy discussions and considerations of the relationship between mindfulness and liberation. I so appreciate that, Luke and Paula. You've held this for a long time, so thank you. And as Lucas said, we've designed the session so that we have one smaller Q&A after the first presentation and a small practice, and then a slightly longer Q&A before the end. And I must acknowledge that I have some, all of you are friends, but I have some very, very long-standing friends in the room. So I want to say that although my name is on this book, it comes from the many collective and collaborative conversations and works with very nourishing communities that has taken place over decades. So we all know that we all stand on the shoulders of giants and in the embrace of our beloveds. And these topics of freedom are so alive, and they're as alive now as they've been for centuries, and they continue to occupy us all as we work for liberation and for freedom in a world in which we all wish to rise. So for any gems in the book, I share authorship with and bow to all of my collectives, and for any blunders, I take singular and full responsibility. I am very aware that it's a book written about accessibility and it's completely inaffordable. So we can laugh together about that later. But I'm delighted to say that the paperback is actually coming out early, and it will be out in about a year's time from now. Of course, we can't see the life of this book outside Jon Kabat-Zinn's 10-second heartfelt vision for a world of well-being. His immersion, practice, and commitment to change, of course, spawned vast uptake of mindfulness in the West. And at the same time, however, it birthed the mindfulness industry. So the book tells the story of how these dreams and imaginings do not occur in isolation of socio-political and economic forces, premised on exploiting difference to create vulnerabilities. And we want to have our eyes wide open to that. The message of the book is for us to remain vigilant as we continue to dream and make change, so that we pay attention to liberating our minds as we seek to liberate our worlds, that we learn to think, do, and feel collectively and not singularly and in isolation, and that we are careful not to recycle harms in the name of change. A guiding light throughout the book is Audre Lorde, and most importantly, her notion, her teaching, her invitation that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And so her reminder is that we are at greater risk of repeating the worlds of domination, of discrimination, of loathing and alienation from ourselves and from one another, when we adopt and use the master's tools uncritically. So the question of power and how we wield power remains a very hot topic. And we're going to just hold that as lightly as we can, but it's right here with us. And I see some new friends have joined us. So wonderful to have all of you here. I'm going to share some slides and we'll move through this section fairly quickly, but I want to create a little bit of framing for parts 1 and 2 of the book. There are 3 parts to the book, and you can see their parts here: the roots of exclusion and othering, wrapping mindfulness in whiteness, and I'll discuss those first 2 before the first break, and then we'll go back into part 3, embodying justice and changing worlds. So I want to start with acknowledging the very title of the book, this title of Disrupting White Mindfulness. And I'm making an assumption here in our circle together that we share a commitment to a just and kind society, and that we understand that we're talking about systems change, and we're not talking about finger pointing at any individuals, that we really are talking about changing systems in order to change society and change the world. But at the same time, we realize that when we change systems, we change as well, right? So in a sense, there is a personal element to this. And we want to use this model, which the fine print you can't see, it's developed by Generation 5 and Alan Grieg. And it's the title of Sites of Shaping and Sites of Change really are to remind us that we are shaped by all of these ecosystems, but this is bi-directional. It's to say that we in turn shape all of these ecosystems. So the book itself is very much about agency and power, and it's about our appreciation that we are agents of change. But just to pause around this notion of shaping, we want to appreciate as well that race and all characteristics of difference are used to fuel divisions by regimes that are premised on divide and rule and exploitation and oppression. So the constructs of race, gender, class, and anything else that is a difference that can be exploited is actually exploited by regimes that are premised on divide and rule. Because the societies that we are living in are so extremely hyper-individualized, it means that these divide and rule strategies don't only create structural harms, they also create social and personal dis-ease. So we can very easily find ourselves, and I'm inviting you to do this now as we hear this title, Disrupting White Mindfulness, that it can land in the body either with a yes, please, and yes, thank you, and at last, and I've been, it's either got that kind of, wow, here it is, and let's go. And it also can land in ways that feel uncomfortable, that feel unpleasant. And of course, this is what we train in, right? In mindfulness, we train in being able to register how these things are landing. And I want to make this link with societies that are premised on divide and rule, create these very kinds of dis-ease, so that we end up sometimes disagreeing to the point where we cannot navigate difference because it hurts so deeply, or it's so uncomfortable, or it causes shame or a sense of embarrassment. So please, for all our sake, please know that we are all welcome here. This is all our work, and we all belong here. It's a very it's a tender issue, because I'm aware that the title has not been always well received within the mindfulness community. And so I'm aware that we need to tread gently and create spaces of inclusion to navigate these challenges that we want to face together. Another way of seeing this is we want to understand that with every effort, every work around systems change, we are inviting individual change. I've no idea where this beautiful picture is from, so I'm sorry that I can't accredit it. Kumi Naidu posted it around climate justice. But the more we are living the modeling of the world that we wish to see, of course, systems change and individual change. These circles are going to merge. The Venn diagram is going to have greater and greater overlap as we manifest and bring into reality the world that we want to see. And as many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the work of Reverend Angel Kyodo Williams, we are reminded as we enter this work that love and justice are not two, that without inner change, there can be no outer change. Without collective change, no change matters. And so again, we want to hold this for our framing so that this space in which we are coming together, we create safety. We create safety for ourselves and we create safety for one another. And the invitation and the encouragement for all of us is that we are gracious in our sharings and in our engagement, that we come with open hearts and open minds and a willingness to learn and to grow. And so the first part of the book is called The Roots of Exclusion and Othering. And we all appreciate where this comes from, centuries of colony and empire. And we want to place our understanding of exclusion and othering back in that understanding of empire and colony, rather than shy away from it, because these roots run so deep within the collective psyche. So we know the atrocities of the establishment of a slave trade, the enslavement of people, the trading in people, the mental superiority and degradation of mind that must be present for such systems to be wrought in the first place. So Edward Said, in his seminal work, 78, seminal work entitled Orientalism, refers to this notion of othering, and he is speaking about what he also calls latent Orientalism. Othering is very much embedded and deep-rooted in the collective mind. It is not something that is an idea that we can necessarily switch on or off. And the systems that we have in place, we'll see with the next slide, oftentimes are recycling these mental models and these mental constructs that are based on exploiting difference, so that we continue to other even when we may not wish to. It's something we want to become a lot more aware of. And what this means in the context of any forms of colonization, and certainly in the context of Orientalism, is that we have these actions then of appropriation and extraction, whereby wealth, people, knowledges are extracted, often sliced up, aspects taken, and then represented as universal knowledge. And, you know, I think this only happens in the West, where the colonial powers tend to reside. I'm not going to say that for definite, but this problem of representing the knowledges that are refashioned as universal obviously lands us in trouble. I should make the statement that I'm having to give you a big brushstrokes overview of the book. So there is far more nuance and subtlety and engagement in the book itself and in the text. And so, for example, with regards to appropriation, some authors like Bell Hooks and the beloved Stuart Hall would speak about appreciation, that there's not only cultural appropriation and extraction, there can also be cultural appreciation, whereby we appreciate aspects of cultures and we assume them as part of our being and becoming, but we are very clear about acknowledging and recognizing where they come from and about holding high the bearers and the keepers of those cultures. So very important that we understand the subtleties. I just love this picture because it's about cementing whiteness, and it was the best depiction I could find. So in terms of colony and empire, when we look at the kinds of systems and ideologies today that reinforce these mental constructs of superiority, we see that the major systems of whiteness and white supremacy, the ways in which these are practiced to skew access to education, mortgages, justice, etc. The rise and the now embedded examples of racial capitalism. The concept, of course, emerged in South Africa, where we were understanding, many authorities decades ago were understanding this exploitation of race and gender in order to advance capitalism to serve a very small elite. And so racial capitalism without the legislation of apartheid, and this is why we speak about de facto and de jure, racial capitalism, of course, exists as much in the States and the UK as it exists in South Africa. And it is from here that we see concepts like intersectionality rooted, this understanding of race, class, gender, and now this increasing understanding of the intersections of many differences that come to be ways of exploiting, discriminating against, and oppressing people. And I want to name shareholder primacy here because the myth of shareholder primacy means that what has now become destructive capitalism is still exploiting people and extracting value and labor for the purposes of a tiny elite of people in the world. We know it's like 8 white men, right, who own something like half the financial wealth of the world. And then, of course, we have to name neoliberalism and post-racialism, which work hand in glove with whiteness. Neoliberalism introducing these extreme conditions of destructive capitalism where we have 0-hour contracts, increasing precarity, cost of living, and the privatization of health. The issue with healthism being that people, because these systems are so hyper-individualized, people are held singularly responsible for anything that goes wrong with their health and made to feel a burden on society and a burden on the state when they are not well. When we simply medicalize stress and other conditions without situating them in their socio-economic framework, we become part of the problem of simply pathologizing stress and any conditions without acknowledging the ways in which people are having to endure through very harsh conditions, sometimes holding down 3, 4, 5 jobs to make ends meet. And of course, post-racialism is like the grandchild of race relations, multiculturalism, color blindness, you know, when we had to all not see color. And now, of course, post-racialism, where race is a construct and it just does not exist. And so why are we even seeing race in the first place? And the issue here, which is important for us, is that the racialized, when we complain about racialization, the racialized become the problem. So similarly to the person who is ill, who becomes a problem and a burden to society, the racialized become the complainant. And Sarah Ahmed even wrote a book, I think at 21, titled The Complaint. So in other words, just suck it up. I want to move over the slide very quickly, but it's really just to show that institutionalized whiteness has the repercussions, of course, of having this tremendous resistance. And the Roads Must Fall campaign, which started right here on at those foothills of Table Mountain, and that's Jamison Hall that you can see. That started here, spread globally, right? So we're seeing a campaign that then gave rise to a fallist movement, fees must fall, etc., that took root across various societies. And all of this was about decolonization. What I've listed here in the listing are those various aspects, those characteristics of difference that intersect and become the site of exploitation and creating vulnerabilities in society. Here's another version of whiteness as it expresses itself in more recent times. So this is actually more the milieu in which Western mindfulness takes root, right? We see here the AI intellectuals in 2015, the 9 white men, including Elon Musk is there among them, who are going to save humanity. So we see here very clearly, as you can see, Timnit Gebru posted this, and she, of course, was very quickly let go by Google for starting to raise ethical issues around their DEI failures. And I simply wanted to honor Bell Hooks, who says something along the lines of, it's usually white, heteronormative, cisgendered men who commonly hold positions of power and decision-making. So that's first part of the book that kind of provides this framing and this way of being able to create foundations for part 2 and part 3. Part 2, this notion of wrapping mindfulness in whiteness. So we've come to understand a little bit about how whiteness comes to emerge, and this nature of white supremacy. And so the realities of whiteness, remember, key in this is hyperindividualism. The realities are the dominant mental models and dominant narratives that actually occupy society. So, you know, when Rev Angel says it's the inner and the outer, there also is the interstitial. There's this very sticky part of our lives that is culture, social media, messaging. And that is the way in which our mental models are constantly fed in order to reproduce dominance and dominant power within society. Of course, Steve Biko at the top, our great revolutionary South Africa leader who was killed by the apartheid regime, says the most potent weapon of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. So when we are thinking mindfulness, we want to understand. We can't go to the mind without going there, right? It's this business of seeing mindfulness as apolitical is almost, and forgive me for using strong language, a denial of the realities of the lives that are being lived. And Bob Marley, of course, sings the words of Marcus Garvey, the great leader, emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. So white normativity, white spaces, intersectional injustices, heteropatriarchy, power over cultures of whiteness and white defaults are very normative in our world. They are very much what we see, what is around us all the time. And so that practice of power over is something that is not always questioned. And of course, we see, over many, many centuries and decades, we've seen struggle, we've seen resistance, and we're seeing new waves of works to decolonize and disrupt structures and systems that are built on whiteness. So the question becomes, in these kinds of societies, when we are practicing, what is it that becomes embodied? And so I'm going to warn you, I'm going to start looking at the data, and I'm going to look at a couple of pie charts. We're going to do this for 5 minutes, people. And I'm going to warn you, it hurts a little bit. So maybe it won't hurt you. Maybe you're okay with this. So my research was done with 3 very prominent mindfulness organizations that work across the world. And I interviewed people and collected data of various aspects of these organizations. And so this is a glance of all staff, the race, gender breakdown of all staff within these organizations. And we see that these spaces themselves are predominantly white, that power is wielded predominantly by white-bodied people. Teachers are mainly white-bodied. Courses and pedagogies are designed by white people with no stakeholder consultation. The scientific base, the evidence base of mindfulness, predominantly undertaken by white researchers. I was doing this work between 2015 and 2018. And often the subjects were white. Teachings which are proclaimed neutral and apolitical and universal aren't. And we've got this one size fits all notion, which feeds into the next slide. So we have organizational power and decision making. And we see here that the higher up the echelons of these organizations, the more we see the decision-making power in the control of white men. And by the way, there is a disclaimer in the book about the fact that I understand that there are more than 2 genders, and that that the book did not engage, or the research did not engage with non-binary and trans issues, and that obviously needs to be developed for this sector. So the social norms here are reproduced in the forms of white male leadership, paternalism, and this is not a big issue. I don't want to overemphasize it, but there were issues of some of the respondents saying, we women do a lot of the work in building up this movement, and the leadership, the men, get the accolades. There are issues of therapization and psychologization, which we discussed earlier in relation to healthism and medicalization, with little regard for the social causes or predeterminants of stress and any other conditions. We're using uncritical science and pedagogies, and we have this development, unfortunately, of the white savior trope, where the one size fits all means we're going to move into communities, offer you mindfulness, and it's going to help things along. And so the social media messaging, as well as the structure and makeup of the sector, reproduces and reinforces this messaging of whiteness and white normativity. And so when we look at reproducing whiteness through pedagogy, we find pedagogies of limitation, that they are uncritical, they are compliant with, often with corporatized education, that we use an audit culture, which is used almost uncritically, and the book discusses what that means, but it's a form of metrication where we're asking people to comply with certain kinds of criteria, very uncritical, and again, not paying any attention to socio-economic and political conditions. So there's no training in social justice or context, and we are recycling and reproducing this problem of what I'm going to, for our sake now, call an elitism and the absence of co-creation. And then this is the last slide for this section, where I want to ask us, what is it? What is it in this context of white mindfulness that becomes embodied? Given that we are shaped by all of these ecosystems that are predominantly white governed, and that predominantly are about sustaining whiteness as a system. And please remember, whiteness is not simply about race. What are the social norms and the defaults that we imbibe? Who models mindfulness that we want to be like? How do mindfulness spaces feel? Do they provide a sense of belonging? Are they spaces of freedom and liberation? And how much do we internalize and embody of the spaces and the culture, the dominant mindfulness culture that we are engaging with in these spaces? So that is a big question. So let me go back to the slides and move on to this third and final section, which is about embodying justice and changing worlds. And just so that I don't forget later on, this is Sherry Mitchell, who speaks about 7 generations. And so the practice we did that was based on 7 generations. The part of it that really is beautiful, let me not distract you, is that we're speaking about us being in the middle of 7 generations, because it's possible for us to remember parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. It's possible that we might be able to relate to children, grandchildren, maybe even great-grandchildren. And of course, there are all kinds of replacements for all of those, right? It doesn't have to be blood. It does not have to be linear. Okay, so the person that we're honoring here is the amazing Prentice Hemphill. And for those of you who have not heard the podcast, their podcast, Finding Our Way, it is an exquisite podcast for anybody engaged in the world of mindfulness who is interested in decolonizing and how we unpack these impressions and imprints that come to reside in our bodies. And may I say, the ways it comes, decolonizing, colonialism comes to sit in us with things like, I'm not good enough, I don't look right, I'm not pay, I should be, all of those things. Often that is the colonizing way of being in the world. So we'll see why this part of the book becomes so important. So Prentice Hemphill says the kind of change we are after is cellular as well as institutional. It is personal and intimate, people. It's collective as well as cultural. We are making love synonymous with justice. So for us, justice is love is justice in action, and justice is love in action. Something like that. We use this concept in Awesome, which I'll speak about later. So I want to, again, broad brush strokes, speak about the foundations of change when we are looking at making meaningful changes that have legs and that can endure. And one of the fundamental pillars is this work of embodied justice, that we are not waiting for justice to be handed to us, that we are liberating our minds. And so when we speak about this quality of presence, we really are speaking about cultivating power within and power with, we're applying the principle of intersectionality so that we don't treat everybody like a homogeneous grouping. We are recognizing difference, and we recognize difference in order to leverage it. That means we have the richness of so many perspectives, and we are able to widen the solution space in order to move forward together. These communities and collectives where we are cultivating embodied justice are communities of radical belonging, where we practice radical love and radical joy. This is not flimsy stuff, people, of rolling over and pretending anything goes. This is clear clarity. It's just like the diamond, right, in the mind and in the heart, of being very clear about what our work is and how we take our steps forward together. So in this work of liberating bodies and minds and collectives, we are embracing the knowledges, skills, and talents and the wisdom that is at our disposal. And we're honoring especially Global South, indigenous, intergenerational, and queer voices. And the reason we are emphasizing these voices is because these are the voices that have been repressed and downtrodden, and that we have not been able to benefit from. So methodologies have been, dismissed, disregarded, and displaced. And we want to reawaken and allow these knowledges and wisdoms to re-emerge. Mindfulness and liberation. This is the first, Mary Seacole, the first statue in the UK of a Black woman. And it only went up a decade or so ago. Somebody can correct me about the date. So the examples, and Mary Seacole says, unless I am allowed to tell the story of my life in my own way, I cannot tell it at all. This is key to how we want to understand new ways of cultivating a mindfulness where the narratives of voices that have been silenced become important. So the examples that are used in the book include the Radical Dharma movement, the East Bay Meditation Center, Buddhist Global Relief, and I will leave people to read about those whenever you are able to lay your hands on the book. I wanted to add additionally the ones that aren't in the book. So Embodied, and I know that Dean and Aisha are in their house. And so Urban Mindfulness Foundation, a call out for you in terms of working to serve models and trainings that are available to Black people, especially, so that spaces change, pedagogies change, methodologies change, etc. The ULEX project, which I know you are involved in, Paula, this merging of social justice work and mindfulness. And then Awesome. There are people in the house from South Africa, and Awesome is an awesome program that trains wellness leaders, where this is really a program based on co-creation, collaboration, and community. So the program is very much taking its lead from people in the room in terms of their hearts, their interests, their desires, and going at a pace of their healing and unraveling as they become leaders who are trained in mindfulness and somatics and various other practices. So what this involves is learning to stand in our power. And these are the aspects of embodied justice, that recognizing that as change agents we have power. We're wanting to possibly reframe and rename the ways we understand power, because we've had certain displays of power, and they've not been displays of power, often been power over oppressive, discriminatory power, which we want to completely turnaround in terms of cultivating power with and power within. That we are able to shape communities and minds when we work together. And I'm just going to drop in that, you know, the neuroscientists are saying to us increasingly, we cannot self-regulate without co-regulation. We actually need communities, belonging, bonding in order to be able to regulate. We need to witness and hold each other in order to be able to co-regulate. So I'm going to move on to the next slide so that we can get through just the remaining slides. But importantly in this slide, the notion that we connect with the cosmos, that we are not only bodies and minds and 3D beings. And I'm going to again gloss over the slide very quickly. I'm sure you people know the anthropologist's story about Ubuntu and the children and how it's very different being part of a community. And we want to understand this degree and extent of hyper-individualism in these societies is also a mindset that we want to liberate ourselves from. And there are words here from Lama Rod Owens, who does ancestral work, from Sherry Mitchell, who says we don't have an exclusive right to thrive, from Dr. Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela and Archbishop Tutu. Forgive me that I'm going to move on. So we want to ask many questions about what the soils are that we are tilling. What are we investing our energies in? What is it that we are imagining? What are the lands that we are cultivating and the seeds that we are nurturing in this work of the head, the heart, and the hands? And in terms of embodied justice, liberation, and freedom, how do we understand justice? Is it a single thing? Is it something that we can package neatly? Or is it something that we are evolving our understandings of? Is it a verb? How do we go about disrupting social norms and mental models and divisive values together? How do we center marginalized groups and interests and decenter whiteness? How do we liberate minds and decolonize mental oppressions and systemic injustices that live in the body? We know the saying, the issues are in the tissues. How do we approach cognitive and epistemic justice in the ways in which we work building forward? How do we widen the solution space? Do all those things that we've spoken about, leveraging difference, disrupting power over, etc. This is the slide that reminds us that we are cosmos spiritual beings, and that no matter how many ecosystems impact upon us, we in turn work outwards. And I think I'm going to draw this to a close, but to say these notions of Ubuntu, the notions of our mutuality, as Dr. King puts it, the notions of we do not have the right to thrive on our own. Of course, for the Buddhists in the house are very like bodhicitta. So it's very like this wish for wisdom and compassion for all beings. So it's just to make sure that we all feel a sense of being able to come in to this conversation and this work together. And my thank you note did not have sufficient African words, and I couldn't find more. But of course, we have to end with. No. Okay. I will stop the share, people. Okay, I'll be good. I'll be good.